April 1945. Germany. The Third Reich is dying. Not slowly, not gracefully, not in the way that empires like to imagine their endings, with grand last stands and heroic final battles that history will remember. It is dying the way all things die when the foundation collapses, fast, ugly, and without dignity. The autobahns that Hitler built to showcase German industrial supremacy are now clogged with the retreating remnants of what was once the most feared military machine on earth. Towns that had hung swastika banners from every window 6 months ago are now hanging white sheets from the same windows. The men who had spent 12 years telling the German people that they were the master race, that they were destined to rule Europe for 1,000 years, are now standing in lines waiting for American military police to process their surrender paperwork. And somewhere in a requisitioned German estate that still has its good china on the shelves and its silver in the drawer, a German general is about to make the single worst decision of what remains of his military career. He is going to demand a silver spoon. Type the word audacity in the comments right now if you already understand what kind of man does something like that in April of 1945, because the answer to that question is the whole story. And what George S. Patton did when that demand reached him is one of the most quietly devastating, most perfectly calibrated, and most completely satisfying acts of justice in the entire story of the American occupation of Germany. To understand why that demand landed the way it did, and why Patton's response was exactly what it was, you have to understand something about the specific culture of the German officer class that the Third Reich had inherited, amplified, and in many ways distorted beyond recognition. Because the silver spoon was not just a silver spoon. It was a statement, a declaration of identity from a man who had decided, even in the ruins of everything he had served and everything he had believed, that his status entitled him to a standard of treatment that the circumstances of his defeat were not going to change. The Prussian military tradition from which the German officer corps had emerged over centuries was one of the most elaborately codified systems of class and status in the entire history of European military culture. According to the detailed historical analysis provided by Isabel Hull in her book Absolute Destruction, which examines the institutional culture of the German military from the imperial period through the Second World War, the German officer class had maintained a self-conception of aristocratic superiority that was not merely professional but deeply personal and deeply cultural. German officers of senior rank did not simply consider themselves to be militarily superior to their subordinates and their enemies. They considered themselves to be categorically different human beings, men of a different and higher order, for whom different standards applied, different comforts were appropriate, and different treatment was not just expected, but required as a matter of basic institutional correctness. This self-conception had survived the First World War, survived the Weimar Republic, survived the economic catastrophe of the 1920 seconds, and had been actively reinforced and exploited by the Nazi state, which found the German officer class's existing sense of superiority extremely useful for building the kind of military force that the Reich needed. The Nazis had given the officer class new enemies to feel superior to and new institutional power to enforce that superiority, and the officer class had largely accepted the bargain without examining it too carefully, because it gave them exactly what their tradition told them they were entitled to. By April of 1945, that entire structure had collapsed. The battles were lost. The territory was gone. The soldiers were surrendering by the thousands. The institutional framework that had backed the officer class's sense of entitlement for 12 years had ceased to exist in any meaningful operational sense. And yet the self-conception remained. In some of these men, it remained with a rigidity and a completeness that the destruction of everything supporting it had not dented, because it was not a conclusion they had reached by examining evidence. It was an identity they had been given so early and reinforced so thoroughly that it had become indistinguishable from the self. The German general in question was a general lieutenant of the Wehrmacht, a two-star equivalent whose name appears in the Third Army processing records of April 1945, and whose capture had been documented by the intelligence officers of the 4th Armored Division during the rapid advance through central Germany in the final weeks of the campaign. According to the processing records in the account of the intelligence officer who handled the initial capture, preserved in the archives of the 4th Armored Division Veterans Association at the Patton Museum in Fort Knox, the general had been found in a large private residence that his unit had been using as a forward headquarters. When the American soldiers arrived, the German general was in the dining room, sitting at the table, with a napkin on his lap. being served a meal by his orderly from what remained of the estate's kitchen stores. He had surrendered without significant incident, which the intelligence officers noted was consistent with the behavior of German senior officers in this period, who had made the rational calculation that resistance was no longer militarily viable. He had been cooperative in the technical sense, providing his name and rank and acknowledging the authority of the American military to take him into custody. But from the moment of his surrender through the initial processing, something about his bearing communicated, with a consistency that multiple American officers who dealt with him noted independently in their reports, that he considered the cooperative surrender to be a practical concession to military reality, rather than an acknowledgement of anything more fundamental. He was, in the language of his own self-conception, an officer and a gentleman of the German military, and he expected to be treated accordingly. He was transferred to a temporary holding facility that the Third Army was using to process captured senior officers before routing them to the more permanent prisoner of war installations that the occupation apparatus was establishing across the American zone. The facility was a requisitioned building, functional and secure, but not furnished with the specific standard of comfort that a senior German officer was accustomed to. The meals being provided were the standard rations that the American military was distributing to prisoners of war in this period, adequate in terms of nutrition, prepared efficiently by the military kitchen staff, and served without the ceremony that the German officer class associated with a proper meal. On his first morning in the facility, the general sent word through the American military police sergeant responsible for his section that he required proper dining implements. Specifically, he requested silver cutlery. According to the account of the sergeant, preserved in a letter home written several days after the incident, the request was delivered with the specific tone of a man making a reasonable and obvious correction to an administrative oversight, rather than a man asking for something he understood he might not receive. The general did not frame it as a request, in the sense that a person in an inferior position makes a request of someone with authority over them. He framed it as a notification that the current arrangements were below the standard appropriate to his rank, and that the relevant correction should be made. The sergeant looked at the request for a moment, then he looked at the general. Then he forwarded the request up the chain of command because it was sufficiently outside the normal parameters of prisoner processing that he did not feel it was his to resolve. It reached Patton. According to the account of Major Alexander Stiller, Patton's aide-de-camp, whose diary from this period is one of the most detailed first-hand records of Patton's day-to-day operations in the final weeks of the campaign, Patton received the forwarded request during a morning briefing that was already covering a dozen more significant operational matters simultaneously. Stiller wrote that Patton listened to the request being read aloud from the forwarded paperwork. That he asked the officer reading it to read the relevant section again. That after the second reading he was quiet for a moment. And that when he spoke, his voice had the specific quality that Stiller had learned over years of working alongside him to recognize as more meaningful than his rages. The quiet voice, the measured voice, the voice of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and is doing it with complete deliberate precision. He asked Stiller whether the kitchen facilities at the holding facility were operational. Stiller confirmed they were. Patton asked whether the kitchen required additional staff to handle the volume of prisoner meals being prepared. Stiller said he would need to check. Patton told him to check and then come back because he had an assignment for the general that was going to resolve the silver spoon question in a way that would require no further communication up the chain of command. Type the word incoming in the comments right now if you can already see where this is going, because what Patton had decided in that quiet moment was more elegant and more devastating than anything the general's demand could have anticipated. The assignment was delivered to the general through the military police sergeant the following morning. The general was informed that his request regarding dining implements had been reviewed by the commanding general of the United States Third Army. That the commanding general had determined that the appropriate response to the general's concern about the standard of kitchen service at the facility was to assign the general to the kitchen staff for the duration of his stay at the facility. He would report to the kitchen each morning at 5:30. He would assist with the preparation of meals for the other prisoners and the American military staff. He would wash the dishes following each meal service. He would perform these duties in his German general's uniform so that every person in the facility was aware of his rank and aware of what he was doing. And he would continue in this assignment until the Third Army determined that he was ready for transfer to a permanent prisoner of war installation. There would be no silver spoon. There would be a sink, a brush, and approximately 400 sets of standard American military mess kit to clean after breakfast, lunch, and dinner. According to the sergeant's account, The general's response to this notification was the most complete and most total silence he had ever witnessed from a human being receiving information. Not the silence of a man composing himself before responding. Not the silence of a man working through the legal framework of his rights as a prisoner of war to formulate an objection. The silence of a man whose entire conceptual framework for the situation he was in had just been so thoroughly contradicted that the machinery of his response had stopped working entirely. He reported to the kitchen at 5:30 the following morning. The accounts of what followed over the next several days, preserved in the sergeant's letters home and in the subsequent oral history of the facility's American staff that has been collected by historians working on the Third Army's occupation period, describe a situation that was simultaneously uncomfortable, deeply human, and in the way that the most significant moments of justice often are, unexpectedly complicated. The German general was not a man who had ever cooked a meal. He was not a man who had washed a dish in the adult portion of his life. The German officer class's relationship with domestic labor was one of comprehensive distance, maintained by the orderly system that provided every officer with personal staff and by a class culture that considered the performance of such labor to be fundamentally incompatible with the identity of a gentleman officer. He entered the kitchen on the first morning with the bearing of a man in an unfamiliar country whose language he does not speak and whose customs are entirely outside his previous experience. According to the account of the American corporal who was responsible for the kitchen at the facility, preserved in the oral history collection of the 4th Armored Division Veterans Association, the general's first attempts at the assigned tasks were a genuine operational problem. He did not know how the kitchen equipment functioned. He did not know the efficient sequence for washing large volumes of dishes. He did not know how to manage the temperature of the wash water or how to stack the cleaned items for drying. He worked slowly, inefficiently, and with a visible internal resistance that made everything he did take approximately 3 times as long as it should have. The corporal, who by his own account had not expected to spend any portion of the war teaching a German general how to wash dishes, found himself in the specific human situation of having to instruct a man who was professionally and culturally his superior at something the corporal had been doing since he was 12 years old on his family's farm in Georgia. He did it. He showed the general how to stack the dishes, how to manage the water, how to work efficiently through the volume rather than treating each item individually. He did not do it warmly. He did not do it with any sense of solidarity or shared human experience. He did it the way a man who has a job to get done and has been given an unexpected obstacle to doing it goes about managing the obstacle, with the practical efficiency of someone who needs the dishes washed and is going to make sure they get washed, regardless of how long it takes the person nominally responsible for washing them to figure out how. What happened over the following 3 days, according to the corporal's account, was something that neither of them had anticipated. The general got better at it, not dramatically, not with any visible enthusiasm, but with the specific, incremental, almost mechanical improvement of a man who has been trained his entire military career to execute whatever task has been assigned to him with increasing competence, regardless of his personal feelings about the task. By the 3rd day, the general was working through the dishes at a pace that was still slower than an experienced kitchen hand, but no longer the operational problem it had been on the first morning. And something else happened that the corporal wrote about with a specificity that suggests it genuinely surprised him. The general started talking. Not much, not warmly, but in the functional, task-oriented way that people talk when they are working alongside each other, and the work creates a context for speech that would not otherwise exist. He asked questions about the equipment. He asked questions about the sequence of tasks. He made occasional observations about the logistics of feeding large numbers of people that reflected, in the corporal's assessment, a genuine professional intelligence that had simply never been directed at this particular domain before. The corporal answered the questions. He answered them the way you answer questions from someone you are working with, because the work requires it. He did not treat the general as an equal. He was not confused about the nature of the relationship or the circumstances that had produced it. But he talked to him, in the kitchen, while they worked. Because the kitchen is a place where the work creates its own social structure, and that structure had temporarily superseded the other structures that governed both their lives. According to the accounts of the American military police and administrative staff who observed the situation over the days it continued, the effect of the kitchen assignment on the German general's bearing was measurable and significant. The specific quality of performed aristocratic entitlement that had characterized his behavior from the moment of his capture, the bearing that had produced the silver spoon demand, had been replaced by something more complicated and less legible. He was not broken. He was not humiliated in the obvious and dramatic sense. He was something more interesting than either of those things. He was a man who had been placed in a situation where his identity's usual tools were simply not relevant and had been required to develop, in a very short period of time, a different relationship with his own competence. The silver spoon request was not repeated. When the account of the kitchen assignment reached Patton through Stiller's daily briefing, the question of whether the general had begun performing his duties adequately was one of the items on the list. Stiller wrote that Patton listened to the account of the first several days and asked one question. He asked whether the dishes were getting clean. Stiller confirmed they were getting progressively cleaner with each passing day. Patton said that was the relevant metric, and that when the assignment had run its course, he could be transferred to the standard prisoner of war installation. But Patton also said something else that Stiller recorded in his diary because he felt it was worth preserving. He said that the silver spoon demand had told him something specific and important about the German officer class that the military outcome of the war had not entirely resolved. That you could defeat an army in the field and sign the surrender documents and process the prisoners through the correct institutional channels and still be dealing with men whose interior relationship with their own entitlement was completely untouched by any of it. That the defeat had changed their circumstances without necessarily changing their understanding of those circumstances. And that occasionally it was necessary to change the circumstances in a way that made the understanding unavoidable. He said that washing 400 sets of mess kit was a fairly efficient way of making the understanding unavoidable. Stiller wrote that he did not have a response to that and that he had simply noted it in his diary and moved on to the next item on the briefing list. The broader context of what Patton was doing with the kitchen assignment, beyond the immediate and satisfying justice of it, connects to one of the most significant and most debated aspects of his approach to the German occupation in the spring and summer of 1945. According to the historical analysis provided by Roger Cirillo in his work on the post-war American occupation of Germany, and by the accounts of Third Army staff officers preserved in the MacArthur Memorial Archives and the Patton Museum collections, Patton had developed, through the experience of liberation and the horrors he had witnessed at places like Ohrdruf and Buchenwald, a specific and uncompromising position on the question of how former German military personnel should be treated in the occupation period. He was not interested in revenge in the simple sense. He was not interested in degradation for its own sake. What he was interested in, and what the kitchen assignment reflected, was the specific psychological and institutional project of dismantling the self-conception of superiority that had made the German military officer class the instrument it had been for 12 years. He understood, in the way that a man who has spent his entire life studying military psychology and military culture understands things, that the beliefs that had produced the camps and the massacres and the systematic brutality of the German occupation of Europe had not been incidental to the German military identity. They had been structural. They had been built into the way German officers understood themselves and their relationship to the people they commanded and the people they fought and the people they occupied. And that dismantling that structure was not something that would be accomplished by surrender documents and prisoner processing forms. It required something more direct. A German general in a kitchen, in his uniform, washing the dishes of American soldiers and German prisoners alike, with the efficiency not of a volunteer, but of a man who had been assigned the task and was going to execute it because the assignment had been given by the commanding general of the army that now had complete authority over every aspect of his existence, was a more direct dismantling of that structure than any formal proceeding could have accomplished. It did not change the man's beliefs. It did not resolve the ideological framework that had produced the silver spoon demand. But it placed him in a physical reality that was so completely outside the framework that the framework's ability to operate as a guide to behavior had been temporarily but thoroughly suspended. And in that suspension, something else had happened. The corporal had shown him how to stack the dishes, and the general had learned how to stack the dishes, and the dishes had gotten clean. That is a small thing. It is not a redemption narrative, and it was never intended to be. But it is a human thing. And in April of 1945, in the ruins of a country that had spent 12 years systematically destroying the human thing in the service of an ideology, the human thing had a specific and undeniable value. According to the records of the prisoner of war installation to which the general was subsequently transferred, he arrived without incident and was processed through the standard occupation channels without further notable events. His file, including the documentation of the silver spoon request and the kitchen assignment, accompanied him to the installation and was noted by the administrative officers who received him. Whether the experience changed anything fundamental about him is not recorded and probably cannot be known. What is recorded in the corporal's account and the sergeant's letters and Stiller's diary is what happened. A German general demanded a silver spoon. George Patton gave him a kitchen and 400 sets of mess kit. And for 3 days in April of 1945, in a requisitioned building somewhere in central Germany, one of the most senior officers of a defeated army learned how to wash dishes from a corporal from Georgia. The dishes got clean. That is the relevant metric. And everything else that happened in that kitchen, the slow improvement of competence and the practical conversations about equipment and the complicated and entirely unexpected human texture of two people working alongside each other in circumstances that neither of them had anticipated or chosen, is the part of the story that does not fit in the official record, but that is worth knowing anyway. Type the word clean in the comments if you think Patton made exactly the right call, because I want to know how many of you see what he actually did in that moment. Not the punishment, the precision, the specific understanding of what a silver spoon demand tells you about a man, and the specific response that addresses exactly what it tells you and nothing else. If this story gave you something that the standard version of this history does not, do one thing before you go. Hit the like button, not for any algorithm. For the corporal from Georgia who showed a German general how to stack the dishes and then went back to his work. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going into the history that is too specific and too human and too quietly true to make it into the textbooks the way it actually happened. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these, and leave your honest thoughts in the comments because I read every single one and that conversation is worth more than the video that started it. I will see you in the next one.